The most dangerous accusations are the ones people believe before the truth ever gets a chance to speak. Rain hammered the empty highway outside Ashford, Virginia, as Caleb Brooks pulled his old pickup truck into the parking lot of a 24-hour convenience store glowing beneath flickering fluorescent lights. The storm had swallowed most of the small town hours ago, leaving only wet pavement, distant thunder, and the low hum of gas station signs cutting through the darkness. Caleb stepped out slowly, pulling his heavy brown jacket tighter against the cold wind while clutching a small folded prescription note in one hand. At 46 years old, his body carried the quiet stiffness of a man who had spent too many years sleeping in places no human being should ever call home. His left knee still ached every winter from injuries nobody in this town knew about. But tonight he was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about his mother sitting alone at home waiting for her heart medication. Inside the store, warm yellow lights spilled across narrow aisles lined with canned soup, motor oil, cheap snacks, and half-empty coffee machines. A teenage cashier leaned against the counter scrolling through his phone while country music played softly through old ceiling speakers. Caleb walked carefully toward the register holding a bottle of water, cold medicine, and the prescription refill envelope the pharmacist had prepared earlier that evening. "That all for you tonight, sir?" the cashier asked without looking up. Caleb nodded politely and reached into his wallet. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill before laying it gently on the counter. The cashier finally glanced up. Then his expression changed instantly. He picked up the bill slowly, holding it beneath the register light while his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He muttered. "Where did you get this?" Caleb blinked once, confused by the question. "The bank," he answered calmly. The cashier turned the bill over again, now visibly nervous. "Hang on a second." Caleb stood silently while the teenager disappeared into the back office with the money still in his hand. Thunder rattled the windows outside as two customers near the coffee machine quietly glanced toward Caleb before whispering to each other. He noticed it immediately, that familiar feeling, the room changing around him before anyone actually said the words out loud. A minute later, the store manager emerged from the office carrying the bill carefully between two fingers like it might contaminate him. "Sir," the manager said stiffly, "this money does not look right." Caleb frowned slightly. "It came directly from First National Bank this morning." The manager did not answer. Instead, he looked toward the front windows where flashing blue lights suddenly reflected across the rain-soaked parking lot. Caleb exhaled quietly beneath his breath. Two police cruisers rolled into the station almost at once, tires hissing across wet pavement as officers stepped into the storm. The taller one entered first, his white uniform collar damp from the rain, eyes already scanning the store with suspicion before anyone even explained the situation. Officer Travis Miller. Caleb recognized the type immediately. The kind of man who walked into a room already convinced he knew who belonged and who did not. "That him?" Miller asked the manager without hesitation. The manager pointed directly toward Caleb. Every pair of eyes in the store turned toward him at once. Caleb remained standing quietly beside the counter while Officer Miller approached slowly, one hand resting near his belt. "Sir," Miller said coldly, "I need you to keep your hands where I can see them." The convenience store suddenly felt smaller the moment Officer Travis Miller walked through the door. Rainwater dripped from the shoulders of his dark patrol jacket onto the tile floor, while his partner remained near the entrance, scanning the store with cautious eyes. Caleb Brooks kept both hands visible beside the counter exactly where Miller could see them, though his expression never changed. Calm, controlled, tired. The same expression worn by men who had learned long ago that staying calm was sometimes the only protection they had left. Officer Miller stepped closer and picked up the $100 bill from the counter. He held it beneath the fluorescent lights for barely 2 seconds before already making up his mind. "Where did you say you got this?" he asked sharply. "First National Bank," Caleb answered. "This morning." Miller smirked faintly. "Convenient answer." The teenage cashier shifted nervously beside the register while the store manager crossed his arms tightly near the cigarettes display. Outside, thunder rolled low across the empty highway as another customer quietly lifted a phone and started recording. Caleb noticed the camera immediately, but said nothing. He had seen moments like this before. Different town, different faces, same feeling. Miller laid the bill flat against the counter and looked directly at Caleb. "You carrying any more counterfeit money on you tonight?" Caleb shook his head slowly. It is real money, officer. Miller ignored the statement completely. Identification. Caleb reached carefully toward his back pocket. The second his hand moved, Miller's voice hardened. Easy now. Caleb froze briefly before slowly pulling out his worn leather wallet and handing over his driver's license. Miller glanced at the card. Caleb Brooks, he read aloud. Address checks out. His tone suggested disappointment more than relief. The other officer stepped closer and quietly asked the manager, "Did the machine reject the bill?" The manager hesitated. "Well, we did not actually run it yet." Miller immediately cut him off. "It looked fake enough to call us." The room fell awkwardly silent. Even the teenager behind the counter looked unsure now. Caleb stood motionless while rain hammered against the windows behind him. Then quietly, almost gently, he spoke again. "Officer, my mother is waiting on medication." Miller looked up sharply. "That's supposed to make me feel sorry for you?" Caleb did not answer. One of the customers near the coffee station muttered under his breath, "Man has not even done anything." Another customer whispered back, "Just let the cops handle it." The tension spread through the store like cold air. Miller opened Caleb's wallet and began searching through it without asking another question. A folded photograph slipped onto the counter. In the picture, a much younger Caleb stood in desert camouflage beside several soldiers under a blazing sun somewhere overseas. Another item slid partially free behind it. A military identification card. Miller glanced at it briefly before shoving it back into the wallet without interest. "Everybody got a story," he muttered. Caleb's eyes lowered toward the photograph for half a second. Something changed in his expression then. Not fear. Not anger. Memory. The kind that never fully leaves a person. But before he could speak again, the teenage cashier suddenly called out nervously from behind the register. "Officer, there is somebody online saying they know him." Miller turned immediately. "What?" The teenager awkwardly held up his phone screen where a livestream comment section moved rapidly beneath shaky video footage from inside the store. Most comments were arguing about the arrest already unfolding in real time. But one message appeared over and over again from the same username. "That man is a veteran. Former Army. Decorated. Do not do this." Miller scoffed instantly. Internet heroes. But his partner looked less certain now. Caleb remained standing beneath the harsh fluorescent lights while the storm rattled the windows around him. Then quietly, without raising his voice even once, he said the words that made the entire room fall silent. "Officer, before tonight goes too far, you should really check that bill properly." The storm outside grew louder, rattling the convenience store windows while tension thickened inside, like smoke nobody could escape. Officer Travis Miller stared at Caleb Brooks for several long seconds after hearing those words. Before tonight goes too far. Something about the way Caleb said it unsettled him. Not threatening. Not nervous. Certain. But instead of slowing down, Miller leaned harder into the authority already building around him. "You giving instructions now?" he asked coldly. Caleb shook his head once. "I am asking you to do your job carefully." The sentence landed heavily in the silence. One customer quietly lowered his coffee cup. Another shifted awkwardly beside the snack aisle, while the teenager live streaming from near the soda machines kept his phone pointed directly at the scene. Thousands of people were watching now. Comments flooded the screen faster than anyone inside the store could read them. Some defended Caleb. Others accused him immediately. But one comment kept repeating again and again beneath the live stream. "Ask him about the Army." Officer Miller ignored all of it. He walked behind Caleb and motioned toward the counter. "Put your hands back there." Caleb complied slowly without resistance. His movements carried the strange discipline of someone deeply familiar with following commands under pressure. Miller noticed it too, though he did not understand why. Caleb stood tall despite the humiliation unfolding around him, shoulders squared naturally, breathing controlled, eyes steady beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Not once had he raised his voice. That almost irritated Miller more than anger would have. The second officer finally stepped closer to inspect the bill properly beneath the counterfeit detection scanner near the register. "Travis," he muttered quietly, "maybe we should wait until—" Miller cut him off immediately. "Counterfeit suspects do not get the benefit of the doubt." Caleb lowered his eyes briefly at those words. Suspect. Criminal. Counterfeit. The labels always came first. Humanity later. Sometimes never. The manager nervously wiped sweat from his forehead while thunder echoed outside again. Officer, he asked hesitantly. If the bill scan's okay, maybe this is all just a misunderstanding. Miller looked at him sharply. You called us because you thought the money was fake. Well, yes, but Miller stepped closer to Caleb again. Where were you before this? At the pharmacy. Before that? Home. Anyone confirm that? Caleb looked exhausted now, more than frustrated. My mother. A faint scoff escaped Miller's mouth. Convenient. The livestream teenager suddenly spoke up from near the coolers. Sir, people online are saying he was military. Miller turned immediately. You want to leave with him tonight? The teenager went silent fast, but Caleb finally looked directly at Miller again. I served 22 years, he said quietly. The room froze for half a second. Miller laughed softly beneath his breath. Sure you did. Caleb did not react. Army. Everybody says Army. Sergeant First Class. Miller smirked again. You rehearsed that too? Caleb slowly closed his eyes for one brief moment, as though forcing himself to stay patient through something painfully familiar. Then the second officer suddenly looked up from the scanner near the register. His expression changed instantly. Travis, Miller barely glanced over. What now? The officer held the bill awkwardly in his hand. It passed. Silence. Nobody moved. Even the storm outside seemed quieter for a moment. The manager blinked in confusion. What do you mean it passed? I mean the bill is real. The words dropped into the room like a weight crashing through glass. Caleb remained perfectly still beside the counter while several customers exchanged stunned looks. The teenager lowered his phone slightly, but Officer Miller's face hardened instead of softening. Pride had already carried him too far to back down easily now. He looked at Caleb again, searching desperately for another reason to justify what was happening. Then his eyes dropped toward the old photograph still lying partly exposed beside Caleb's wallet on the counter. A younger Caleb stood surrounded by soldiers wearing desert camouflage beneath an American flag whipping through the wind. And for the first time that night, uncertainty finally crept into Officer Travis Miller's eyes. For several long seconds, nobody inside the convenience store spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead while rain streaked down the windows behind the gas pumps outside. The counterfeit scanner still glowed green beside the register, silently confirming what Caleb Brooks had said from the very beginning. The bill was real. The tension in the room shifted immediately, but Officer Travis Miller refused to let go of control that easily. His jaw tightened as he looked from the scanner back toward Caleb, standing quietly beside the counter. Caleb had not moved, had not argued, had not raised his voice once. Somehow that calmness made the silence even heavier. The second officer slowly lowered the bill onto the counter. Travis, he said carefully, maybe we should clear this up and move on. But Miller's pride had already backed him into a corner. He glanced toward the customers watching from the aisles, then toward the phone still recording every second of the scene. Too many eyes now. Too much humiliation waiting for him if he admitted he was wrong. Counterfeit bills still pass scanners sometimes, he muttered defensively. The manager blinked in confusion. Not this machine. We just had it replaced last month. Miller ignored him completely. Instead, he picked up Caleb's wallet again and flipped through the contents more aggressively than before. A folded military commendation letter slid partly free. Then another photograph. In this one, Caleb stood beside several soldiers near a military helicopter somewhere deep in the desert. Younger, but unmistakably the same man. Dust covered their uniforms while exhausted smiles crossed tired faces. Officer Miller stared at the image briefly before scoffing. Could be anybody. Caleb finally looked at him directly again. No, officer, he said quietly. It was us. Something about the way he said those words silenced the room all over again. Not pride. Not ego. Memory. The kind forged in places most people could never imagine. The livestream teenager near the coolers suddenly stepped closer, still staring at his phone screen. Sir, he said nervously. People online found him. Miller frowned immediately. What are you talking about? The teenager swallowed hard before turning the screen around. An article filled the display beneath shaky livestream comments. There was an old photograph of Caleb in military dress uniform standing beside senior Army officers during a medal ceremony. The headline read, Local soldier awarded Silver Star after saving fellow troops overseas. The second officer's eyes widened instantly. Holy! He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. The manager leaned closer toward the phone while customers whispered among themselves. Caleb lowered his eyes briefly, as if he wished the article had never appeared at all. Officer Miller stared at the screen, then back toward Caleb. "This some kind of joke?" Caleb answered softly. "No, sir." The second officer carefully took the phone from the teenager and kept reading. Decorated Army veteran, multiple overseas deployments. His voice grew quieter with every line. Awarded for evacuating wounded soldiers during enemy fire. The store felt frozen now. Even the coffee machine, near the back, sounded louder somehow. Caleb stood there beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, looking less like a criminal with every passing second and more like something nobody inside that store had expected to see tonight. A man who had served his country quietly for decades only to stand humiliated in a gas station because someone looked at his skin before looking at the truth. Miller suddenly straightened his posture, searching desperately for authority slipping through his hands. "None of that changes procedure," he snapped. But his voice lacked certainty now. Caleb tilted his head slightly. "What procedure?" Miller opened his mouth, but nothing came out immediately. Because deep down, he understood something terrifying in that moment. There had never really been a procedure. Only assumptions. Outside, headlights suddenly swept across the parking lot as another vehicle pulled into the gas station. An older man wearing a military veteran's cap stepped out slowly into the rain before freezing near the entrance window. The second he saw Caleb standing beside the officers, his entire face changed. "No," he whispered under his breath. Then he pushed open the door and stared directly at Caleb Brooks with disbelief in his eyes. "Sergeant Brooks." The older man stood frozen near the entrance of the convenience store while rainwater dripped from the brim of his dark veteran's cap onto the floor beneath him. His eyes stayed locked on Caleb Brooks with growing disbelief, like he was staring at someone pulled straight out of another lifetime. "Sergeant Brooks?" he repeated quietly. Caleb turned slowly toward the voice. For the first time all night, something softened in his expression. "Recognition." "Frank?" he asked. The older man stepped forward immediately, ignoring the officers completely now. "My God," his voice trembled slightly. "I knew it was you." Officer Travis Miller straightened beside the counter, visibly irritated by the interruption. "Sir, this is an active investigation." But Frank barely looked at him. "Investigation?" he snapped. "Do you even know who this man is?" The room fell silent again. Caleb lowered his eyes briefly, almost uncomfortable with the attention suddenly shifting toward him. Frank shook his head in disbelief while pointing toward Caleb. "This man carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire while the rest of us thought we were not making it home." The second officer slowly exchanged a glance with Miller. The livestream teenager moved even closer now, phone shaking slightly in his hands while thousands of viewers flooded the comment section faster than ever. Frank continued staring at Caleb with the kind of respect that could not be faked. "Fallujah, 2007, he said quietly. "Roadside explosion hit our convoy outside the city. Most people would have taken cover." His eyes grew distant for a moment, trapped inside memory. "Not him." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "Frank." "No." Frank interrupted gently. They should hear this. The rain outside intensified again, rattling the windows while everyone inside the store listened. Even Officer Miller no longer interrupted. Frank pointed toward the old photograph lying on the counter. "Half the men in that picture are alive because of him." Caleb exhaled quietly beneath his breath, but remained silent. The manager near the register looked completely stunned now. "You really served with him?" Frank nodded immediately. "Served under him." He turned back toward Caleb again. "You disappeared after retirement. Nobody knew where you ended up." Caleb finally answered softly. "I came home to take care of my mother." The simplicity of the sentence somehow made everything heavier. 22 years in uniform. Silver Star recipient. Decorated Army veteran. And tonight he stood humiliated in a convenience store, trying to buy medicine for his mother, while strangers treated him like a criminal before checking a single fact. Officer Miller looked visibly uncomfortable now, but pride still refused to let him fully step backward. "Military service does not exempt anyone from investigation," he muttered defensively. Frank stared at him in disbelief. "Investigation?" he repeated. "You accused him before you even scanned the bill." The second officer quietly lowered his head. Nobody argued because everyone knew it was true. Caleb remained standing calmly beside the counter while thunder rolled low outside across the dark Virginia highway. Then Frank noticed something else. Caleb's left hand trembled slightly while resting against the edge of the counter. Not fear. Pain. Your knee still bothering you? Frank asked quietly. Caleb gave a faint nod. Cold weather. Frank shook his head sadly. You carried half your squad on that leg. Officer Miller's face changed slightly at those words. He looked again at the older man standing before him. Not a suspect. Not a counterfeit criminal. A soldier. A veteran. A man other soldiers still spoke about with reverence years later. The livestream comments exploded even faster now. Veteran hero falsely accused. Decorated soldier humiliated. Army sergeant treated like criminal. The story was spreading beyond the town already. Caleb noticed the phones. The whispers. The sudden shift in the room. But none of it seemed to matter to him anymore. He simply looked toward the medicine still sitting quietly on the counter and asked one calm question. Officer, may I please take my mother's prescription home now? And somehow, after everything that had happened, that simple request sounded far more powerful than anger ever could. No one inside the convenience store seemed to know what to do after Caleb Brooks asked that simple question. The storm outside continued pounding the empty highway while fluorescent lights reflected against puddles gathering near the entrance doors. Officer Travis Miller stood motionless beside the counter, his authority slowly unraveling beneath the weight of everything now staring back at him. The counterfeit bill was real. The live stream had gone viral. The man he accused in front of strangers was not a criminal at all, but a decorated Army veteran respected by people who had actually served beside him. Yet somehow, Caleb still looked like the calmest person in the room. Frank stepped closer toward the counter and picked up the prescription bag carefully. Heart medication? He asked softly. Caleb nodded once. She cannot miss a dose. The manager immediately looked ashamed. Sir, I am sorry about all this. Caleb gave a faint polite nod, but his eyes carried exhaustion deeper than anger. It was the exhaustion of someone who understood this night was not really about a $100 bill. It was about suspicion arriving before truth ever had a chance. Officer Miller finally cleared his throat awkwardly. Look, he muttered. We were responding to a call. Frank turned sharply toward him. No, he said firmly. You were responding to assumptions. Silence dropped over the store again. Even the customers filming earlier now looked uncomfortable holding their phones. The teenage cashier quietly lowered his eyes toward the floor. The second officer beside Miller appeared deeply unsettled too. He kept replaying the scene in his mind from the moment they entered the store. Caleb standing calmly beside the counter. The bill never properly checked. The wallet ignored. The military identification dismissed. Every step moved too fast because someone decided guilt first and facts second. Caleb slowly reached for his wallet while the old military photographs remained partly visible on the counter beneath the harsh lights. One picture showed him much younger beside exhausted soldiers smiling through dust and smoke overseas. Another showed him receiving the Silver Star in formal dress uniform while standing beside senior officers. The contrast between those photographs and the humiliation unfolding tonight felt almost unbearable to witness. Frank shook his head quietly. You know, he said toward Miller. Men like him spend years protecting people they have never even met. Miller stared down at the counter without responding. And this is what he comes home to. Outside, more headlights appeared in the parking lot. News spread quickly in small towns, especially when the internet arrived before anyone could control the story. Two local reporters stepped through the entrance carrying cameras beneath dripping rain jackets. One of them immediately recognized Caleb from the livestream clips already exploding online. Sir, the reporter asked carefully, is it true you are a decorated Army veteran? Caleb looked toward her briefly before answering in a calm voice. I'm just trying to get my mother's medicine home. The sentence hit harder than any dramatic speech could have. The reporter lowered her microphone slightly. Behind her, customers continued whispering while comments flooded across livestream screens faster than anyone could follow. Hero accused over real money. Veteran publicly humiliated. Small-town officer under fire. Officer Miller noticed the headlines appearing in real time on nearby phones. His face tightened further with every passing second. For the first time all night, he seemed to understand that this moment would follow him long after the storm ended. Caleb carefully placed the prescription bag inside his jacket pocket and reached for the bottle of water still waiting beside the register. The manager immediately pushed it toward him. It is on the house, he said quietly. Caleb paused for a second before finally taking it. Thank you. Then he turned toward the exit. Every person inside the store watched silently as he walked past them with the same calm dignity he had carried from the beginning. No yelling, no revenge, no anger, just quiet disappointment. But as Caleb reached the door, Officer Miller suddenly spoke again. Sergeant Brooks. Caleb stopped without turning around. Miller struggled to find words now buried beneath pride, shame, and fear all at once. Then finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked the question that should have been asked from the very beginning. Why did you stay so calm through all of this? Caleb looked out through the rain-covered glass before answering softly. Because after war, officer, you learn some battles are fought long before anyone notices them. By sunrise, the storm over Ashford had finally passed, but the story from the convenience store had already spread far beyond the small Virginia town. News clips flooded television screens across the state, while social media feeds replayed the same moments over and over again. Caleb Brooks standing quietly beside the counter. Officer Travis Miller accusing him before checking the bill. The military photographs sliding from the wallet nobody bothered to examine carefully. Millions of strangers now watched the humiliation unfold frame by frame from the safety of their phones, while headlines argued over what the night really meant. Some called it a misunderstanding. Others called it something far deeper. Inside the Ashford Police Department, the mood felt tense long before sunrise coffee finished brewing. Officers whispered quietly near desks while television screens mounted across the station replayed footage from the livestream. Nobody laughed. Nobody joked. The silence itself felt uncomfortable. Officer Travis Miller sat alone in a small administrative office, staring at the same clip looping endlessly across the monitor mounted on the wall. Every time he heard himself say counterfeit suspect, something tightened inside his chest worse than before. The problem was no longer the internet. The problem was that deep down, he no longer believed his own excuses either. A knock sounded softly at the office door before the police chief stepped inside, carrying a tablet beneath one arm. Chief Raymond Hale was a broad-shouldered man nearing retirement who had spent 30 years navigating small-town politics, angry citizens, and difficult officers. But this situation already felt different. Dangerous. You know who called me at 5 this morning? Hale asked quietly. Miller shook his head. The Regional Veterans Association. State Media. Internal Affairs. He paused heavily. And a retired Army colonel from Richmond asking why one of his decorated soldiers was treated like a criminal over legal money. Miller lowered his eyes toward the desk. The chief stared at him carefully for several seconds. Tell me honestly, Hale finally asked. Did you ever actually think that bill was fake? Miller opened his mouth to answer, but stopped immediately. Because the truth had become impossible to avoid now. The suspicion started long before the bill ever touched the scanner. Long before the wallet opened. Long before anyone checked facts. The second he saw a black man holding a $100 bill inside that store, his mind had already written the story. Chief Hale slowly exhaled through his nose. That silence tells me everything I need to know. Across town, Caleb Brooks sat quietly beside his mother's bed while soft morning light filtered through thin curtains inside their modest home. A half-empty cup of coffee rested near the medication bottles on the nightstand, while old military photographs hung quietly along the hallway walls. Caleb's mother looked weak but peaceful now that her medicine had finally arrived. You were gone a long time last night, she whispered gently. Caleb forced a faint smile. Store was busy. She studied his face carefully. Mothers always knew more than people realized. Something happened. Caleb looked down at his hands for a moment before answering softly. Just people making assumptions. His mother sighed quietly, sadness crossing her tired face. Your father used to say this country loves uniforms more than the people inside them. Caleb glanced toward an old framed photograph sitting near the window. His father in Army fatigues decades earlier. Another black veteran. Another man who came home carrying invisible battles nobody wanted to understand. Outside, tires rolled slowly across wet streets while reporters gathered near the police station downtown. Protesters began arriving too, holding signs demanding accountability and fairness. Some were veterans themselves. Others simply recognized something painfully familiar in Caleb's story. Back inside the station, Chief Hale placed a suspension form on the desk in front of Officer Miller. The room remained silent except for the distant hum of reporters outside the building. "You did not just embarrass this department," Hale said quietly. "You reminded an entire country what happens when suspicion sees skin before humanity." Miller stared down at the paperwork without speaking. And for the first time in his career, the weight pressing against him no longer felt like public outrage. It felt like truth. Over the next several days, Ashford became the center of a national conversation nobody in the town had expected. News vans lined the streets outside the police department, while reporters crowded sidewalks, searching for reactions from anyone connected to the convenience store incident. Television hosts debated the footage every night. Veterans organizations released public statements defending Caleb Brooks. Civil rights groups demanded accountability. But through all the noise, Caleb himself remained almost completely silent. He never posted online, never gave interviews, never stood behind microphones demanding revenge. That silence only made people listen harder when his name was mentioned. Inside the Ashford Police Department, internal affairs investigators reviewed body camera footage frame by frame. Every uncomfortable detail became impossible to ignore now. Officer Travis Miller dismissing the counterfeit scanner, ignoring the military identification, treating Caleb like a criminal before evidence ever existed. What disturbed investigators most was not the mistake itself. It was how natural the assumption seemed while it happened. Chief Raymond Hale sat through hours of review meetings watching the same footage until exhaustion settled deep into his face. "You know what scares me?" he finally said quietly to another investigator. He stayed calmer than everyone else in that store. The investigator nodded slowly. "Because he has probably lived through moments like that before." Across town, Caleb spent most mornings helping his mother around the house before driving quietly to the local Veterans Center outside Richmond twice a week. He never mentioned the convenience store incident there either. But people had already seen the videos. Veterans approached him differently now. Some with sympathy, others with guilt. One older Marine shook Caleb's hand tightly after a group meeting and whispered, "You deserved better from this country." Caleb only smiled faintly. "Most people are trying their best," he answered softly. But deep down, even he sounded uncertain saying it now. One afternoon, a black SUV pulled into the gravel driveway outside Caleb's home. A man in army dress uniform stepped out carrying a small case beneath one arm. Colonel David Mercer had served with Caleb years earlier during overseas deployments and now worked with a National Veterans Foundation. Caleb looked genuinely surprised seeing him standing near the porch steps. "Colonel," Mercer shook his hand firmly. "Still calling me that after retirement?" Caleb gave a faint smile. "Habit." Mercer glanced toward the house behind him. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" They sat quietly on the old wooden porch while autumn wind rustled trees across the yard. For a while neither man spoke. Finally Mercer opened the small case resting on his lap. Inside sat Caleb's silver star medal, polished carefully beneath the afternoon sunlight. "We are organizing a national veterans ceremony next month," Mercer said quietly. "We want to honor you publicly." Caleb looked uncomfortable immediately. "There are other men more deserving." Mercer shook his head. "This is not only about the war anymore." Caleb lowered his eyes toward the medal. The medal reflected sunlight softly across his weathered hands. "I did not serve to become a headline," he said quietly. Mercer studied him carefully before answering. "That is exactly why people need to hear your story." Meanwhile, Officer Travis Miller remained on suspension pending formal review. Every day felt heavier than the last now. He stopped checking social media after thousands of comments flooded his accounts calling him racist, abusive, and unfit for the badge. At first he blamed the internet, then the media, then politics. But eventually the noise faded enough for something worse to settle in. Reflection. Late one evening, Miller sat alone inside his dark apartment replaying the body camera footage yet again. He paused on one specific moment. Caleb standing calmly beside the counter saying, "Please check the bill properly." The truth had been sitting right there from the beginning. But Miller realized something painful watching the footage now. He never actually looked for truth that night. He looked for confirmation of a suspicion he already carried before walking through the store door. And once he finally understood that difference, the silence inside the room became unbearable. 1 month later, the small town of Ashford looked almost unchanged from the outside. The same quiet roads, the same gas station signs glowing late into the night, The same convenience store sitting beside the highway where trucks still stopped for coffee and fuel during long drives across Virginia. But for many people, something inside the town had shifted permanently after that night. Officer Travis Miller officially resigned from the department before the internal affairs investigation concluded. The town council held tense meetings for weeks afterward while citizens argued about policing, bias, accountability, and whether trust once broken could ever fully return. Some defended Miller. Others said the problem was never one officer alone. But even among those arguments, one truth remained impossible to deny. Caleb Brooks had been treated like a suspect long before anyone looked at evidence. And the entire country had watched it happen in real time. Caleb himself never became the angry public figure many reporters hoped for. He declined nearly every interview request sent to his home. He never sued the department, never stood at podiums demanding revenge. Instead, he quietly returned to the life he had before the cameras arrived, caring for his mother, volunteering twice a week at the Veterans Center, fixing old trucks in his garage when his knee allowed it. Yet somehow, his silence carried more weight than speeches ever could. Late October brought cold winds across Virginia as hundreds of veterans gathered outside Richmond for the ceremony Colonel David Mercer organized in Caleb's honor. American flags moved softly in the autumn breeze while old soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, wearing faded unit caps and medals earned decades earlier. Caleb arrived wearing a simple dark suit, looking deeply uncomfortable with the attention surrounding him. He had spent most of his life avoiding spotlights. But when Colonel Mercer stepped to the microphone and spoke about courage, sacrifice, and dignity under pressure, the crowd listened in complete silence. Some heroes reveal themselves in war, Mercer said steadily. Others reveal themselves when the war follows them home, and they still choose dignity instead of bitterness. Caleb lowered his eyes quietly as applause spread through the crowd. Then Mercer surprised everyone by inviting him to speak. Caleb hesitated before slowly stepping toward the microphone beneath the pale afternoon sky. Hundreds of people watched him carefully now. Veterans, families, reporters, strangers who once only knew him as the man accused over a $100 bill inside a convenience store. Caleb stood silently for several seconds before finally speaking in the same calm voice that carried him through everything else. "When I was young," he said softly, "I believed respect came automatically with service." The wind moved gently through the flags behind him while the crowd remained perfectly still. "Then I learned something harder. Sometimes people see your skin before they see your sacrifice." No one moved. No one looked away. Caleb glanced down briefly at the Silver Star medal resting against his chest. "But bitterness is its own kind of prison," he continued quietly. "If we allow anger to define us, then the people who judged us unfairly continue controlling our lives long after the moment ends." Even the reporters lowered their cameras slightly now. Caleb looked out across the crowd of veterans standing before him. Men and women who understood invisible battles better than most people ever could. "This country is not perfect," he said softly. "But the answer to injustice cannot be more hatred. The answer has to be truth, accountability, and the courage to see each other fully before deciding who belongs." Silence lingered after he stepped away from the microphone. Then slowly, one veteran began clapping. Another followed. Then another, until the entire crowd rose to their feet beneath the cold Virginia sky. Hours later, as the sun disappeared behind rows of autumn trees, Caleb stood quietly alone near the edge of the parking lot preparing to leave when a familiar voice spoke behind him. "Sergeant Brooks." Caleb turned slowly. Travis Miller stood several feet away wearing plain clothes now instead of a police uniform. He looked older somehow, smaller without the badge. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Miller finally lowered his eyes and said the words pride once prevented him from saying. "I was wrong about you." Caleb studied him carefully before answering in a calm voice. "No, officer." He paused gently. "You were wrong about what you thought you already knew." The wind carried silence between them once more while fallen leaves moved softly across the pavement. And standing there beneath the fading evening light, Travis Miller finally understood something that no investigation, suspension, or public scandal could teach as deeply as truth itself. A person's dignity should never depend on whether the world recognizes their medals first,